to Melbourne to visit my great-grandmother. And in her backyard, she had this, it was a bird cage with this little white bundle of feathers and ugly blue saggy eyes. And it belonged to her grandson, who was moving out and getting married, and there was no way in the world his wife was going to let him take that thing with him. So at 5 years old, my brother was like, please, 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 can we have it, please, please, can we have it? And my parents relented. 4 hours later, we arrived back home in northeast Victoria with this cage full of feathers and beak and ugly blue eyes. And on the way home, we decided his name was going to be DoolieBird. Now, if anyone's seen that character on TV, the cartoon character with the DoolieBird, he walks pigeon-toed. That's just how DoolieBird used to walk around. And he'd sort of mosey on over to wherever you were, and if you weren't careful, he'd nip your toe. DoolieBird was my bird. But the first 24 hours that we had him home, my grandmother, this overbearing grandmother, which I loved, but she was the bane of my mother's life, she was announcing, why would you bring such a stupid, ridiculous animal here? Oh, no, she was going all over the place. And without a word of a lie, this bird, who could say lots of things, but as if on cue, he sent out the washing and got too close to his nest, he'd take off after her. She got clever. She realised that Dooley was actually frightened of the straw broom. And so she started to take the straw broom out when she hung out the washing. And if he got, what you whinging about? Well, my grandmother was speechless. And even though he could say lots of other things, he never ever repeated that phrase. He loved to greet people as they came to our house. And it was okay for friends or neighbours or family that actually knew about DoolieBird, but if we had some poor unsuspecting visitor sort of walk down our front path towards our door, they'd hear a little voice say, hello, what do you want? And they'd sort of look around. And they never suspected that Dooley was sitting in the foliage of the tree in our front yard. He had a love-hate relationship with my mother. And even though he was my favourite bird, underneath the clothesline, he built a love nest. And the love nest actually started out being a big pile of bark, which was meant to be for our wood heater. But Dooley had dug a hole underneath this pile of bark, and every day he'd get a piece of bark in his beak and he'd sweep it out lovingly and he'd sweep around it. And if my mum ever went to hang out the washing and got too close to his nest, he'd take off after her. She got clever. She realised that Dooley was actually frightened of the straw broom. And so she started to take the straw broom out when she hung out the washing. And if he got too close, she'd wave the broom around and he'd run. And that worked for quite some time. Until one day, Dooley realised that when she swept the broom at him, if he grabbed hold of it, he could flip himself up onto it and start climbing up the hairpin. Which meant that Mum would drop the broom and run. But it worked for me, that trick, because if ever I was being chased around the yard by my horrible older brother and his friends, all I had to do was on the run, I'd lean down, pick up Dooley, he'd put his beak onto my finger, I'd flip him up onto my arm and turn. And I could command any number of marauding boys with my feathered weapon of mass destruction. He loved our neighbours, particularly Norma Bagley on the right-hand side of us. Every year she would lovingly tend her bulbs and await the arrival of the most beautiful blooms. And it'd get to the day when the bulbs would finally flower. And over would go Dooley, and he would go nip, 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 every single bloom and leave a trail of green stalks and no flowers. So Norma didn't like Dooley very much. But he also loved the neighbour on the other side of our house, Bob. Bob was a mechanic and he kept a meticulous shed. And on a few occasions, Bob's poor boys got a hiding for being in the shed making such a mess. Until one day he went in there, having left the door open of the shed, and he saw Dooley going piff, 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 all the jars of his nuts and bolts and nails onto the floor. But Dooley's favourite person in the whole world was Norm Golding. Norm was a family friend and Dooley just loved him. Even more than me, he loved Norm Golding. And one day while Dooley was flying around, because we used to cut his wing feathers on one of his wings to keep him out of trouble, and every couple of months his wing feathers would grow back and start flying around the town, and we get some frantic phone call, "McLean, come and get your rotten bird!" So this one day, Dooley's wing had grown, and he was harassing poor Stan Dixon as he drove past. And as he was harassing Stan, he noticed a big crowd of people over at the footy ground. Now, Norm Golding was actually the coach of the Seconds football team, and at half-time, Norm had the fellas out on the green. He's like, "Come on, we've got to get things done." And some of the fellas started to laugh. Well, that just infuriated Norm. He's like, "This is no laughing matter." And then he looked down and here's Dooley between his feet going, "Whee! Whee!" So Dooley spent the night in the footy club, then he went to the pub, and then he was brought home by the police car really late that night. When I was about 16, my parents built a new house just out of town. And so when we moved out there, we didn't have much of a garden or trees or things, and he'd been used to spending his evenings with the chooks. In winter he'd go and rest with the chooks. And we didn't take the chooks with us, so he was a bit lonely, there wasn't so many trees. So we had a cage built for him. And after a few months, he actually felt comfortable enough to come out of the cage, and he went to visit a sulphur-crested cocky that was up the road in an aviary. He did that a few times, but then one day, he didn't come back. And what we think happened was, over the road from the sulphur-crested cockatoo lived Jennifer McCallum, who was a very keen and very proud gardener. And what we think happened is that Dooley went and did some gardening for her, and she didn't like his work. And he never came back. So even though we're not really sure what happened to Dooley, and he's not around anymore, you can be sure that anyone who has lived in Chiltern for longer than 20 years has either known Dooley, or they know of the antics and the tales